we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to Artform Studio. We are here with the author, creator, co-coordinator of TheMash Up, hip hop photos remixed by iconic graffiti artists, and then one of the participants within that project, Jules Muck, aka Muck Rock. So thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to check it out, I really, really recommend people make time to go see the new Contact High exhibit at the Annenberg Space of Photography. How many folks here have already been? Okay.
Oh, look at that.
So I'm half preaching to the choir, but I mean, some of Janette's iconic photography, much of which is being, of course, riffed on in this book, is on immense, beautiful display in the space, and it's just such a fantastic job that Vicky Toback put together with that book.
And not only that, if I can, Photoville, which is just happening in the Century Park there, we have these 8-foot mashups done by 4 incredibly famous LA artists, one of whom is sitting right here next to me.
So we are very fortunate to have Janette in town with us for this. And why don't we just start with some basics here? How did this book project come about?
Well, somebody came to me, and Say Adams, who's the co-author of the book, and he's really the curator of the book, saying they wanted to do a pop-up art event with us. And I just didn't really know what to do, and Say suddenly came to the meeting and he was like, I've got an idea, I'm going to get my friends to draw on your photos. And I was like, your famous graffiti artist friends are going to want to draw on my photos, are you sure? And he said yes, and so he asked 10. Jules was one of the original ones, artists, and we gave everybody a deck of photos from my archive, and they were allowed to choose which one they wanted to draw on. And we made 11 by 14 prints and gave them to each artist and said, do whatever you want to do. And we had a little opening in New York City in my loft, and 400 people turned up. It was like a hot summer's day. It was so crazy. So, after that, Say ended up curating more artists. People were coming out of the woodwork, like Zephyr, for instance, who hadn't really been doing much for a long, long time. He suddenly he was there when we were having a show somewhere else, and was like, I want to do one. And, Lee Canonas, Futura, Lady Pink. We really got the most amazing group of artists. We have 30 now.
Were there any photos that you thought, I don't want graffiti over? Were you pretty open to what you wanted of yours? Were there any particulars that you wanted to?
You know what? I was totally open to having all of my archive reinterpreted, because the artists that Say curated are so amazing, and I have so much respect for them. I didn't know them before. Jules and I had just met at It was like a graffiti jam that we met at. Yeah.
We were photographing. But I just want to insert that these photos, they're epic photos. Yeah. So they're so well known, and of course, unfortunately, I didn't know that they were all yours. But most of these images were, and some of them I've already painted renditions of, because that's how inserted into the culture they are, and how they represent the whole time frame of a feeling of the generation, and so it wasn't like just painting on someone's photo. It was like getting to be a part of history. It was an honor and a privilege to be allowed, and then to have them showcased. It's so cool.
I actually had a question about some of the basic logistics, because you have so many photos, but also so many artists. And given, Janette, that you have so many, as Jules has mentioned here, you have so many photos that have become, and I know the word iconic gets thrown around a lot, but I don't know what a better term is, given that a lot of us have grown up as hip hop fans seeing the images that you and others have taken. But my question here is, how could you make sure that the artists, 2 different artists or more, didn't want to do the same photo? Because if you look through the book, there's no photo that gets repeated, but did people have to do rock, paper, scissors in order to claim this?
Well, part of the project was that every artist had to, to say why they wanted to paint on a certain photo, and then they had to also say what was their first wall they ever painted on, and I had to do a portrait of them. So it was we had this whole project going, and after once an image was chosen, nobody else was allowed to paint on it, and that was the end of that. But luckily I have a lot of photos that nobody's ever seen, and just speaking to Jules said. I mean, I do not look like the person that, I don't look, if you thought of a hip hop photographer, it probably wouldn't look like me. So I think a lot of people, are sort of, wow, you took that picture. I had that on my bedroom wall when I was a kid. It's so weird, but, I was just very lucky.
I was listening to your interview on NTS on the Meltdown, where you were talking about your place in Covent Garden, your boom box, and playing a lot of music. That was a great interview because I got to hear a lot of your musical talent. Can you talk about how you came into hip hop, how you came into the culture world?
Well, I grew up in London, and I went to art school, went to photo school, and when I came out of photo school, punk was happening. Punk and all those other cultures, skinheads, two-tone mods, everything. And I started working for this weekly music magazine called Melody Maker. And luckily for me, I worked for them from 76 to 82, and luckily for me, the chief photographer was really into rock, and I wasn't into rock at all. I was into punk and ska and soul, so I got to do all the things I liked while he went, flying off to Texas to do Led Zeppelin. So it was totally great. And then, in the fall of 1982, the very first hip hop show to come to Europe came to London, and we didn't know what hip hop was. And so, of course, I immediately put up my hand, like, what's this? I wanted to see what it is. And that afternoon, when the concert was going to be, I went to the hotel where everybody was staying. And, I had my camera, and I just started taking pictures of all these amazing-looking people because, when you think about English punk, everybody's kind of dressed in leather jackets, and they kind of like angry and, kind of rough-looking. And then here come these hip-hop kids, and they just have this, like, amazing energy, and, they're totally different style. And that afternoon, I photographed all these people. I didn't know who they were, and it turns out later that it was Futura, Dondi, Africa Bambaataa, the Rocksteady Crew, Fab Five Freddy, Rammelsy, Double Dutch Girls, DST, all these people who just were legends of the culture, but I didn't know. And the concert was mind-blowing because all these people were on stage together doing whatever they do. And I was coming to visit a friend for Christmas, that Christmas in New York, and I just, got off the train, and I was on East 4th Street, and it was cold, and, there's a kid carrying a boombox, and there's someone breakdancing on the street, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. And I really never went back. Apart from to visit. And I just started, getting involved in the culture.
And Jules, same question for you. You've been writing, I think, since at least the mid-'80s. How did you get your start?
Well, I did start in like the 90s, definitely. But what's weird is that, like, if I had started in the 90s in America, I would have been like kind of in the second coming, but I started in the 90s in Europe, and I had been sent to Greece at the time. So it was right when that book Subway Art hit, and everybody was into like underground hip hop there, and we started writing graffiti. And then when I came back to the Bronx, I just kind of like played catch up, and when I met some of the more old school cats, it was probably late 90s, and Lady Pink took me under her wing.
Wow.
And she totally adopted, made me go with everybody. She'd be like, okay, you're gonna go paint with Fuzz. And these guys were like deep-seated like hip hop guys. Like Fuzz One would go bombing in a full Adidas red tracksuit with shell toes.
No. Wow.
Like, it was freaking cool, like everybody was like, there was a lot of that old school vibe was still there because I met the right people, and Zephyr and all those guys were really cool about schooling me because I was, I guess at the time, like I was the toy, and they took me around and taught me what I needed to know. Kat would let us crash on the floor at the Stretch magazine office. So there was a lot of that hip hop, like underground thing still going on, but it was, I would guess, what would be called the second or third wave even. Yeah.
And just to bring this up to current here, you ended up choosing a very young LL Cool J photo from Janette's archives to riff on. How did you end up choosing this, and how did you end up wanting to do the piece that you did for the book?
Well, I love that photo, and what was weird is that I had painted a version of that. I had copied the photo, which I grabbed from
Google Images or something,
I
you know,
love that.
without knowing, before I met her, before I knew anything about, I mean, it was before the project started when I painted it, but I always do that. Like, I always incorporate photography, and that's why I love this project so much, is because I'm already kind of mashing things up. I just have to do so much more work without the photo to start with. So, but that's definitely a favorite.
You started out photographing punk and moved to hip hop. Can you tell me if there are any differences or similarities that you see between the two cultures, especially as it relates to attitudes, punk attitudes, hip hop attitudes?
I have to say, I mean, for me, there were a lot of similarities because punk, was like the British kids, working class kids, kids from poor backgrounds, getting up and saying, fuck the Queen, fuck everything in the history. We want our voices. There's no future for us. We don't have any jobs. We're poor. This is shit. And that was really what punk was all about in the beginning. And you listen to any Sex Pistols song, No Future or whatever, and and also nobody had any money, so they were making their own clothes, taking their mom's sweaters, cutting them up, and ripping things up, going to army surplus, and just getting things in yard sales and stuff. And then when I came here, it seemed like exactly the same thing to me, because it was kids from the Bronx and stuff who really they didn't really have much of a future either. They couldn't see how they were going to get work or just even survive on a daily basis. And I mean, I hate to be a little obvious, but a song like The Message just pretty much says all of what it was like in New York at the time. And so there were a lot of similarities, and the kids had this whole style that they made up, and even someone like Dapper Dan, everybody wanted to look good like kids do, and they couldn't afford Gucci, so he made his own Gucci. I mean, that's like so punk in a way. So I see a lot of similarities, but it's just that in New York, people are a bit more upbeat and kind of go-getting than London. So that's kind of the difference.
I had a similar question about parallel communities and overlapping communities. And Jules, I'm really glad that you brought up subway art. There's a copy sitting up there, which was, of course, done by Martha Cooper, shooting a lot of the late 70s and early 80s graffiti writers in New York who were doing those, end-to-end train pieces. And Martha was a photographer, but basically photographing writers. And that book, along with Style Wars and similar Wild Style and et cetera, did such an important role in helping hip hop culture move from New York and then move globally. And so what I'm wondering about is, because both of you were there in different ways and in these different eras, how closely aligned were the kind of street photography or hip hop photography world and the graph world? Because as much as I can see parallels, I also assume they're not identical communities. Where are the points of similarity and difference that both of you saw?
With the photography?
Well, no, and the community of photographers and the community of writers, like how close do these things intersect or move in different directions?
I think they were pretty close. I mean, I think when you say hip hop, that includes, in my view, art, graffiti art,
and the photographers were there like always. I couldn't believe they still do, but they show up. Like, the people that photograph graffiti are so hardcore. They are like, you're like, how did you get there? And like, I turn around and I don't know, there was a couple that used to do it, Carla and Jim Murray, and they would be always like, right behind me on the train tracks. They had pit bulls they would walk around with. And they showed up to everything. And that's how, I met a lot of photographers, because they would be there. I didn't meet them at their shows. I met them like on the grounds where we were painting. And that's how I met Janet, like right there in the yards.
Where was that? We met in New Haven,
In the
right?
skate park, yeah.
The skate park, yeah.
But
cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and Martha Cooper, I mean, without Martha Cooper, half of this art wouldn't even exist, because obviously it was immediately painted over. So Martha and Henry Chalfant, they recorded everything, and it's brilliant, that sort of grand obsession that they had, turned out to be, they were documenting the culture. And, I feel to a certain extent, I have a lot of pictures of, one hit or semi-hit wonder rappers that, maybe aren't so famous, but that, they made one record and then they kind of went off and had kids or something, but I have those pictures, which is a great thing.
I guess part of what I'm asking is it seems like it's a very symbiotic relationship, which is to say that without the writers, the photographers don't have something to photograph, and on the flip side, a piece that you make might be, as a writer, might be gone tomorrow because someone paints it over or
Right.
the authorities intervene, and so that documentation might be the only extant evidence that you ever made the piece. So, and I think the book, to me at least, honors that relationship that goes back decades between the ways in which the writers and photographers on some level need one another.
Yeah, we really wanted, in the book, we really wanted to actually honor the artists, not just, oh, they're painting on my photos, because, every artist has a piece of their own work in there, and it's really about the artists and the work they do, and, I'm, extremely honored to have all these legends, reinterpret my art and make it into something different now. And, it's an important thing, and it's sort of bringing it to present day, because, I took most of those photos in the 80s.
Yeah, it must be fun to have, like, they're photographed and then they're painted, then they're rephotographed.
Right.
I mean,
It is. It's brilliant. It's so brilliant, and I really love the way the book came out. And we're kind of like for me, I didn't know any of these artists before, and now I feel like, wherever it's like having a posse,
Yeah.
And I feel like hip-hop culture's always been like that. Like, you go places and everybody's like, hey, what's up? I mean, just at the Annenberg right now, I'm meeting all these hip-hop photographers that I'd never met before. That we're all hugging, and it's a very cool community. Really, really good, and I think it all music and art has always gone hand in hand to me, so.
Question
Yeah.
for you. One of the things that's been most refreshing, I guess, about this book is this is the era of hip hop that I grew up in. So it's nice being able to see myself, my memories, going back in that time. I grew up here in Los Angeles on 60th and Crenshaw. The types of murals that I saw were really different. My vision of hip hop at that time, East Coast hip hop culture, came largely through magazines and videos. And so the neighborhoods that I grew up, I saw a lot of tagging, a lot of murals on train tracks, and every now and again there'd be like a gorgeous memorial to someone. To that end, I was driving to a function, and I happened to turn off Hauser and go to Washington, and I ran right into your beautiful Centoya Brown piece. And it just gave me so much hope. It's a gorgeous
Thank
piece.
you.
Can you talk a little bit about what went into you making that piece?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm often struck by the different the stories we hear, and that's what prompts me to paint. And then, like, a photograph captures the story of this person, I feel like I want to be a part of the story and perpetuating it. And like you said, like, no one would really know about a lot of the graffiti if no one took a photo. No one really knows about anything unless you document it and then put it out there for people to see. And that's why I love graffiti art. As much as I love fine art and museums, it's not out there and accessible to everyone. But when you go and paint on the street, you're really just putting it out there to whoever passes by. And that's something that story, I think, needed to have more life, more eyes, more minds, more thoughts on it, because it's kind of inspirational how it's working out, and we don't always hear that.
It's beautiful, and it really humanizes her. It's a one picture we see where she's not in court, where she's not in the oranges, where she's not surrounded by a lawyer, and it's just it's just beautiful and stunning. So thank you for doing that piece.
Thanks.
Another question I have for you is, we talk about hip hop, and we have to combine the cultures: photography, hip hop, graffiti. How do you think graffiti has helped to move the culture forward as you see it?
Well, I mean, when I grew up, it was like there's 4 elements, there's the emceeing, DJing, breaking, and writing. And graffiti was just like, we're the visual support besides for breaking, so if anybody needed an album cover or a poster or anything, like, that's how it came to, that thing brought it off the street onto the kind of more mainstream, that aspect, being the support system, being the backdrop for the dancers. And whenever there was like a b-boy competition, we were brought in to paint, and so there was just, co-support. And I think that's what did it, is like we helped build each other because we needed a soundtrack, we needed a human element, we needed the visual.
Right. And just speaking to that, you know, when I was doing my pictures back in the day for British magazines who really wanted to know what was going on in America in the 80s, you know, as far as hip hop. You know, I was really lucky because I'd walk around the corner and there would be somebody had thrown up some huge tag and I was like, oh, let's just do it here. I mean, I had wallpaper for all of my pictures, which was amazing. And years later, people are going, oh, that's so-and-so's tag, that's so-and-so's tag. So it's actually a cool thing. And actually in the book, Chino, who did the Stetsasonic, I had photographed Stetsasonic in front of this, this Chino, the lovely Chino with his lovely dog. I'd photographed Stetsasonic in front of this poster on the wall in the Fulton Mall, and it turned out that he saw my picture of Stetsasonic, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago in some rap magazine, and he was like, oh wow, look, that's my tag.
Yeah.
And then he got in touch with me, and he was like, can you send me a picture? So I sent him the file, and then, you know, I don't know how many years later, he's drawing over his own tag, which is kind of brilliant story.
It's so meta. I love
Yes,
it.
it is. It's brilliant.
Jules, you were bringing up a moment ago about the difference between how, when we think of art, there's street art and then there's fine art, which is in museums and institutions. And given that Morgan and I had just come from the Contact High exhibit, you know, in this beautiful space at the Annenberg inside of Century City, on the one hand, and we were talking about this with Vicky Toback, who curated the exhibit, it's amazing to see, you know, all of these hip hop photos that we have experienced through the years through magazines and album covers now in this, you know, quote unquote high art institution, and it feels like, okay, we've cracked the door open, we've gotten in here. But then part of me also always thinks about that scene going back 40 years to Style Wars, where they're in that downtown gallery, and you have all these people kind of gushing over what I kind of thought was sort of mediocre looking art compared to a lot of the subway pieces that the rest of the film showed. And it felt in a way certain kind of cynical in terms of the ways that a lot of these art dealers were talking about this when they clearly didn't have a basis in the street element of it. For them, this is just the next big thing that they can invest or speculate on. I don't want to treat 2019 like it's still 1982, but I'm wondering for each of you, as you've seen hip hop cross more and more over into the world of so-called high art or just conventional traditional art that has traditionally been hostile to street art, how much better have things gotten, and on the flip side, how much more of a distance is there to go so that the art that you all champion can be accepted as art without a qualifier before it?
Yeah, I mean, wow, that was a lot because that's everything. That's what we're you know, I'm so happy whenever anyone even talks about art, you know, and the street art, especially, like anybody talking about it. If some high art guy is telling you that this means that, and that's cool, maybe he sees that, that's great. Just the fact that it's something that gets people to communicate with each other, and when we start crossing over different boundaries called, like, you know, different social classes, and they're all talking about similar art forms, that's awesome because it becomes a unifying factor. And it can do so much more than just be a pretty piece, because now these different kinds of people can talk to each other.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And there's so much street art around now, and people in different communities, you know, are experiencing it, and they're experiencing art, and also thinking that maybe they could grow up, kids can grow up to be artists. It's very inspiring. And, you know, having that show in Annenberg, I mean, hopefully they're going to bring schools, you know, from Compton and wherever to go look at it, because a lot of those kids think that museums and galleries aren't really for them. And, you know, that's, you know, I'm always trying to do shows in places where, you know, people can actually come and look at it who maybe, you know, it's not on their normal track, you know.
I mean, you were saying before we started that you just did a mashup event at the space and with children just this past yesterday, I guess.
Yeah, we just did at Photoville, we did a mashup event, and, you know, we printed out 100 of my photos, just, you know, 11 by 14, and we had loads of markers and things and tables, and 100 people actually signed up to do this, which is a lot. And they all came, and, you know, they were like grandmothers and, you know, mothers and fathers and kids, and everybody was drawing, not just the kids. Everybody like picked up markers and started drawing. And the pieces they made were amazing. I mean, the salt and pepper one turned out to be popular, and some little 5-year-old girl had like made them into superheroes and done capes and crowns, and I mean, it's so, you know, and everybody's painting red lipstick on Chuck D's mouth, and you know, putting like wacky glasses on him. I mean, it's really fun to see these kids' imaginations, and people were really having a good time. We had to, I mean, they were queuing up like an hour before. So I think, you know, and that's what you want. You want to bring it to kids, because a lot of, you know, you want to encourage kids to think that, you know, art is a great thing, and it's good for them to express themselves and give them the opportunity. So, you know, I'd be happy to do that in all the cities around America. It would be really fun.
I love your gaze. We were both at the exhibit, and everyone was taking pictures with their phone, and I took a lot of pictures, but when I came home, I realized I'd say 98% of the pictures I took were of women. I love how you photograph women. It's so nice to see so many of the icons of hip-hop and see them, to me, looking very royal and regal. Can you talk a little bit about those two gorgeous shots in there? Queen Latifah and Salt and Pepper. Can you tell us the stories behind those photos? I'm so curious about the making of those photos and what happened that day.
Well, I actually had met Salt and Pepper before they even had a record contract. They were just like, this English magazine somehow had heard about these two girls from Queens who were trying to, you know, rap. So we had spent a day in Alphabet City in Lower East Side, just, you know, wandering around the streets, and I was taking pictures of them, and we were just giggling and laughing, and then they were like, oh, we've got a record coming out, can you be our photographer? And I was like, sure, that'd be really fun. So, you know, because we were just getting along, you know, we were like having ice cream and sodas and just chilling. And that was probably about the third photo shoot I'd done for them. And by that time, you know, they'd got a lot more confidence. And, you know, they'd got some bigger chains and bigger hoop earrings. And, you know, they'd got Dapper Dan jackets, which was pretty amazing, which I didn't know until much later. And, I mean, it was, and we actually had a hair and makeup person, which we didn't have, of course, in the beginning. So it was much more of a, you know, a proper photo shoot. And, you know, I think we just knew at that time, I mean, Salt and Pepper, when that was on the cover of Let's Talk About Sex on the 12-inch. I mean, that was when the girls started fighting back and saying, you know, well, actually, we've got a voice, and it's not just about boys, you know, admiring us and talking about the girl around the way, and, you know, she's got this, that, and the other. It's like, actually, we've got something to say. So I think, you know, to me, this really expresses girl power. And it was mashed up by a woman artist called Claw Money, who I'm sure Jules knows. So, you know, that's kind of the story of that. And actually, right now I'm talking to Salt and Pepper about maybe I think they're doing like a series for Lifetime, and we may be going to recreate that shot, which I don't know how it's going to be, but it might be fun. They've got the jackets still.
And to Morgan's point, I mean, the fact that Lady Pink chose Queen Latifah to riff on, and really I think one of the most beautiful pieces in the entire book. What's the story behind both the original photo and when you first saw what Lady Pink did with it, what did you think?
Well, that photo I actually took for my first ever hip hop book that I was doing with Bill Adler in 1990, and I was like, we have to have Queen Latifah, so we got her finally to come around the studio. And, you know, it was a pretty quick photo shoot. You know, she was pretty big by then, and, you know, it was kind of a privilege that she actually even came over for it. And, but just actually this year she's doing a series for some university about confidence, how to have confidence. I think it's like a 6-part series. So she actually asked to interview me. Well, she didn't, but somebody, you know, interviewed me for this, talking about confidence and what it means, which is a tricky subject, but I do think that photo expresses a lot of confidence. And Lady Pink, it's funny because we asked her if she would do one, and in the book she says she doesn't really even like rap, but she loves her queen. She just loves Queen Latifah. She's more of a rock person, but she did an amazing job with that. I mean, it's such a beautiful piece.
Yeah, I think it's really cool that it's like the Queen of Graph and Queen Latifah.
You know, it seems very
Exactly.
fitting.
Pretty on point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oliver and I host a podcast called Heat Rocks, where we sit down and talk to artists, writers, and scholars about canonical albums, and we ask them particular questions about not just the album, but their experience with the album. It's just a conversation about music. So for both of you, what albums or what songs have been particularly inspirational to you while you were working on the book or while you were working on what you ended up submitting to the book? What were you listening to?
Oh, when you were painting, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
We did play Salt and Pepper. Obviously, the last one that I just did, I had it on the phone because you kind of have to, right? I mean, I always try to do that though if I'm working on a piece, you know, just to get the vibe of the musician I'm painting, you know, to make sure they'd be down for the piece. So you want to kind of do it with their flow going, for sure.
I mean, for me, you know, I have to spend a lot of time on the computer now because all of these were shot on film. So we didn't have to spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time in the dark room. And when I was in the dark room making those prints back in the day, you know, I had my hip hop mix. And, you know, it wasn't even old school then because obviously I was printing them, you know, in the 80s and 90s. So, you know, I was listening to everything, you know, Slick Rick, Eric B. and Rakim, you know, LL, all of it. Yeah, exactly. Oh, Guru, Gangstar, big Gangstar fan. And, you know, obviously Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul and all of those people. Moni Love.
Should we hit him with the 3 words?
Yes, indeed.
All right, go for it.
Uh-oh.
We always end our podcast by asking our guests if they could describe, you know, the album that they're talking about in 3 words. So if you had to describe your book in 3 words, what would they be?
Wow, that's a deep question. I would say...
And you can't use mashup because that's cheating.
Oh, okay. Well, because that was my 2 words. No. Okay. I would say, you know, history, culture, and hip hop.
Well done.
Well, I mean, it's not my book, but I think
But still.
I think it's very powerful. I think it's a little crazy
Yeah.
and potent. I would say it's pretty potent.
Any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Yeah, here.
You want me to do it?
They're taping this, so.
Okay. Hi. It kind of actually goes back to your question and both what you guys were talking about earlier about how like hip hop music, culture, graffiti art, everything is becoming more accepted, you know, as more in like the fine art world. But as that happens, also it also becomes more expensive, right? And so the question that I have is like when you started doing photography, I feel like hip hop artists were so much more accessible. Or maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. So like through the years, as you've seen the way the music has been accepted changing and people paying more money for it and more people accepting it, has the accessibility to artists also been affected by that? Like how has it changed? That's what I'm really asking.
Well, that's a good question. And honestly, you know, back in the day when I was doing it, it would just be me and whoever, these little tiny I was working for these little record companies like Def Jam, it's a tiny little record company, Sleeping Bag and Next Plateau, all of these, they would just send the artist over to my studio and often there wasn't an art director or anybody and I would just walk around the streets with them and it was great, you know, and then we'd just chat and because my photos I always feel like are a collaboration between me and the artist, so you know, that's how I really like to do it the best, and I do that now still. But yeah, so it would be really simple. Now, you know, if you're taking a picture of Jay-Z, they own everything. They're going to edit everything. They're going to say which picture, and you're not allowed to show them to anybody. You can't put them on your website. You know, it's a buyout. You can't, I mean, it's a whole other thing. I mean, the whole art thing, you know, the access for the artist who actually made the piece is sort of shut down. And, you know, it's sad. And if you do live concerts now, you're only allowed to photograph the very first song, which everyone knows the best pictures are at the end of the concert when everybody's hot and sweaty and they're really having a good time. So things have really changed, and you have PR people stopping you, and, you know, everybody knows what their best side is, and the social media and selfies. It's really changed a lot, and I was just lucky. You know, I was working in the early days, and it was, bearing in mind, it was a small thing, right, Jules? I mean, it was underground. So nobody knew when I took that picture of LL Cool J, that is his first ever press shot.
Wow.
He was probably 17 years old. I mean, it was an underground thing. It wasn't like I was photographing a big star. So that's, I think, my answer. I don't know.
I think that's why it's cool that you're doing the mashup, because you get to use these photos like they're new again, because there's nothing new to replace these kind of photos. This is done. This, for the most part, it would seem that kind of like casual accessibility is done. So we still love it and we still want to see the images, but in order to make the images new and vital, you brought the artists in, and I think it's a genius idea, you know. I love it, and it's something that's interesting to look at, whereas a lot of the very doctored photo shoot photos that you see these days are not as fun.
No, and it was before Photoshop, so, you know, you take a picture.
What you saw is what you got.
Yeah, what you saw is what you got. And I mean, when I first came here, because I had all these pictures of English punks, I went around all the big record companies, you know, CBS, whatever, Warner Brothers, and they were like, well, your work is too gritty. We can't hire you. They wouldn't hire me at all. And finally, they're like, oh, there's this group, the Fearless Four, they're kind of hip-hop, you know, we'll give you them. And that was, luckily for me, the start of, you know, that was my first album cover. They gave me, you know, just chuck that little hip-hop thing to me. I don't know. I mean, to me, I don't like perfection. And that's, you know, I don't know what to tell you.
It's more interesting when it's imperfect, because that's where your eye goes. Yeah.
Totally, exactly.
Anybody else?
Really quick, I just wanted to thank you guys for keeping hip-hop culture alive, because for me, as an immigrant kid from Iran who came here, I learned English from hip-hop music, because they would speak, and it taught me, I'm a poet now, and it taught me that there's different ways of doing poetry. And what I loved about hip-hop was the resistance factor. Like for me, in Iran, I remember my mom and grandma being held for hours because they didn't have their head covered properly. And you had these, and we couldn't say anything there, and you had these guys saying, fuck the police, on a record, and to me that was like, oh my God, my heroes. And then going to my first hip hop show as like a nerdy kid who was bullied, and everyone was the same, and you didn't even need to know how to dance, you just threw your hands up and did like this. And so it's an important culture, because in many ways, so thank you guys. In an age of hip-hop becoming very commercialized and bling-bling, to keep alive this original art form of it. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, please come on up.
It's kind of a threefold, I guess. What's next for the mashup? At this point, do you have a waiting list of artists that want to participate? And how do you get involved?
That's a good question. Well, I think, you know, we have to go to Say for that, because he's the curator. And, you know, I mean, I personally would love to have more, you know, do Mashup Book Part 2 and have more artists, you know, work on it. I mean, when we did the Photoville thing, so we had Jules, who's already in the book, but we had 3 other LA artists who are not in the book, which is Mr. Cartoon, Max242, and Jeff Soto. And, you know, yeah, they are wonderful pieces, and we wanted to have this LA vibe. Jules is already here, of course.
I appreciated that about the event, actually. I felt like it helped celebrate, even the Contact High helped celebrate a lot of LA and West Coast.
LA culture, right,
you know,
exactly.
And kind of the bridge between, historically, there always seemed to be, you know, and maybe that's just the media portraying this beef, you know, but over the years, you know, even where I grew up in San Francisco, even the outlying suburbs, everybody in San Francisco had a problem because they wanted to be part of the city. But as we've all gotten older, as hip hop has matured, as everybody's, you know, trying to move their art forward, their creativity forward, those gaps are smaller and smaller, you know, and I feel like there's more love, not just across California, but globally, right?
I think you're right. I mean, hip-hop is global. It's huge. I mean, it's huge in Africa. It's huge in Europe, you know. I mean, it's pretty much all over the world, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
You know, and it really is about people express. I mean, it's poetry. Who was saying? You were saying you're a poet. I mean, to me, I always thought it was poetry, except, you know, to a beat. So it really encompasses so many art forms that we love.
Music's always been a part of that soundtrack for me too. My first graffiti name was my b-boy name, and it's like there's always been music that's played an influence, and so I thought this was perfect to bridge that gap too, and just keep that.
Thank you. Well, you're a great artist too, as we know.
If you do a sequel, it should be called TheMash Up 2, Electric Boogaloo. I'm just going to throw that out. All right, anybody else? Well, we have copies of the book. We have two of the people involved here to sign it if you care to check it out. And again, if I can plug, please do make your way out to Century City and check out that contact eye and see some of Janette's work in sort of full-blown color and just wall-to-wall. It's really amazing. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you all for coming on a Sunday.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Mashups at Photoville when you go to see Contact High. Cool.